Hello, everybody, and welcome back from your very first break. What we're going to be doing again in the second half of class is talking about the history of psychology and where it's developed into what it is today. To introduce this idea, what I thought we'd do is do another little mini activity. So, what I'd like you to do is think back to when you were a young child, and if you can, think about what you wanted to be when you grew up. My guess is that a lot of you were probably aspiring to be doctors, nurses, pilots, maybe mothers, fathers, whatever it is. I'm guessing a lot of you probably did not think about being a psychologist. In fact, I would be surprised to hear one student saying that they actually wanted to be a psychologist when they grew up. Why is this so interesting? Well, the reason why it's exceptionally interesting is because when we look at college majors, people actually graduating from most developed countries, what we see is that even though most people have no interest in being a psychologist when they're a young child, by the time we get into college, psychology becomes an exceptionally popular major. If you look at psychology, the third one from the bottom, what you see is this is one of the few major only things listed here. Yet, even though it's just one particular field, it's comparable to almost all the other fields combined. So, health professions, which means doctors and nurses, we have almost as many psychology graduates nowadays as we do doctors and nurses. Same thing with education. We have almost as many psychologists as people in all of the social sciences. And the only real major that seems to be outnumbering psychology nowadays is business. And that's primarily because there's a large number of business directed schools, and business is kind of an all encompassing major. That's important again because when we look at the difference between what children want to do and what adults want to do, we see a huge transition. Business is kind of under that same realm, but this transition to psychology, this real growing interest in it, is something that has amazed people in the field for many, many years and has brought lots of people to ask, well, what is it about psychology that makes it so appealing? What gets people into this particular profession, even though they don't necessarily have an inkling to do this when they're young children and aspiring to be something? Well, the reason why psychology is so appealing, the reason why you probably should have something interesting to talk about after each of these classes, is because even though we're not necessarily trying to control people, our attempts to understand human behavior, understand the human mind, define terms that can explain how we act and why we act, and also use this information to predict people is a very, very beneficial thing. Now, it's not that people are rushing to psychology because you're going to be able to read people's minds or manipulate them like you might see in movies or television shows, but just the sheer ability to understand human nature is something that's drawn many of us to the profession over the years. But this hasn't always been the case. In fact, when we look back at psychology's early years, it wasn't really a distinct science for quite some time. When we look back to what we probably can attribute to psychology, what we see is that it was probably rooted in both the fields of philosophy and biology. In essence, philosophers questioned the mind with logical arguments, asking people about how we think, what goes on, maybe how our memory or our perception works. And biologists were studying the human body, looking at its structure, looking at its systems. And what eventually happened was the scientific approach of biology and the focus on the mind of philosophy and have allowed these two areas to combine and produce psychology. And when people got into this field, they started studying some of the main things that both philosophers and biologists were trying to understand. One of the first things they started trying to understand and research was something we call the mind-body, and oftentimes now we call it the mind-body-brain problem. This is based on the question of whether or not that voice you have in your head, the perceptions that you have, all of the different thoughts and inklings that you experience on a regular basis are actually independent of your body. Can we remove that mind, that experience that you have, from all the tiny cells and all the structures that you have within you? This is something that was a very heated debate when we didn't have the ability to dissect the human brain and the human body to the level that we're capable of doing nowadays. But even in today's society, there is a huge number of people that believe this debate is completely unresolved. And this mind brain body problem is one of the things that propelled philosophers and biologists to come together into the field of psychology. Another major question that people ask is this question of free will versus determinism. Namely, when you do something, say listen to this class or sign up for a course, talk to a friend, sleep in instead of getting up early on some days, what we might ask is what caused that particular behavior? People who believe in free will argue that it's just something going on inside your head, something that you decide to do, void of any experience or any situation that's prompting you to do that. Determinists argue, and we'll talk about a very specific branch of determinists later called behaviorists. Well, these determinists argue that if we look at all the environmental factors, the people around you, the stimuli that you encounter, all the different rewards and punishments you've had in your past, we should be able to predict with absolute certainty what you're going to do from moment to moment. Well, this question of free will versus determinism was something that philosophers asked for many years. But when we started trying to scientifically answer this question by coming up with statistics, results that might be replicable across individuals, we moved into the field of psychology. In that same transition, one last big question that pops up is this idea of nature versus nurture. So are you a person who you are because of something inborn within you, your genetics, your biological predisposition? Was it something that's entirely dedicated to fate, something spiritual or something that we have no control over? Or is the person you are a product of your environment? Your parents teaching you to behave specific ways, you learning differences between right and wrong, you learning what you prefer in terms of what's right and what's wrong. This question of nature versus nurture was a third big thing that led people into the field of psychology. But who got us there? Well, that's an interesting story as well. When we look back to psychology's roots, most people attribute the field of psychology to one particular man. Now, he wasn't probably the first person to coin the term psychology. In fact, nobody thinks he was the first person to coin the term psychology, but he was the first person to really move into a true attempt to study the mind as a psychologist, and his name was Wilhelm Wundt. I know it looks like it's not pronounced that way, but Wilhelm was very, very German, so we pronounce it Wundt. And the reason why we consider him the first psychologist was because he was the first person to actually create a lab that encouraged people to study these ideas of the mind, the basic concepts of the mind, through a scientific lens. And what he was extremely interested in was our concepts of perception. So he did study things like memory and other areas, but his main focus was on understanding how we as human beings make sense of all the different stimuli, all the different things going on in our environment. So what he would do is create tests, little experiments, to show how people were interpreting what was going on in their environment. If you want to replicate this, I encourage you to pause this presentation after hearing what I instruct you to do, so you can see how some of the basic processes of the mind that we take for granted actually work. What I'd like you to do is take a ball, one that makes actual noise. So if you've got like a soccer ball or a tennis ball, baseballs don't work very well because they have to be able to bounce. What I'd like you to do is lift the ball up significantly high above the ground on a hard surface and drop it. And what I want you to do is stare at that ball and see if the sound made from that ball actually matches up with when you think you're supposed to hear that sound. So you should have it standing, drop it, and what you're going to see is oftentimes that you think the sound should happen a little bit before it actually does occur. This is actually something Wundt found with a sound device a number of times. We call a metronome. So we'd have the metronome going back and forth, and it would click every time it would hit the sides. And every time people were asked to predict when the sounds were lining up, they were expecting it to happen a little bit sooner. In fact, he found it was about an eighth of a second. This was just kind of a subtle finding to Wundt. Nobody really took much notice of it. But it's an example of really the power of his experiments. What's also really interesting is the fact that even though this particular finding of Wundt's didn't make him popular, didn't make him really well known at the time, other people since Wundt have actually picked up on this information. And one classic person who's picked up on this, which most of you have probably heard, is a man named Walt Disney. And Disney actually stumbled upon Wundt's idea by accident. When he first started creating his moving pictures that we now call cartoons, like the one you see on the right, he ran into a major problem when he started showing it to people. He would set up the script, have the ball moving or rolling, and as you see there, bouncing off somebody's head. But when he lined up with a computer, the sound, or actually with just a slide projector, the sound with the actual contact. So when the sound occurred at the exact moment that the contact was made, people seemed to be put off. People thought that there was actually a slight delay in the sound. So what Wundt started doing was changing things up. In essence, he had the sound precede the contact by about an eighth of a second, the exact finding that Wundt had discovered many, many years ago. And this particular example of people spinning off Wundt's findings is a classic case of what happened in the field of psychology once Wundt started studying it. He would find all of these tiny little tidbits about how we made sense of our environment, and people would find applications to it. And after setting up this lab, we really started getting the ball rolling in the field of psychology. The next big person to kind of pick up on Wundt's ideas and theories was a man named Edward Titchener, who actually was Wundt's student for many years in Leipzig, Germany, where Wundt taught at his lab and university. As Titchener studied with Wundt, he started coming up with his own ideas, his own perceptions of what to study in the field of psychology, and decided to move to the United States and start teaching in the very first psychological lab in the U.S. He moved there in 1892, and once he arrived, he decided to start studying the field of psychology through the lens of a specific mentality or concept that he called structuralism. So what he was interested in wasn't all the different knacks and findings about perception, but what he was really focusing on was how we were able to make sense with very basic elements of our perception of the world. So a classic example of what he would do is use a technique that we call introspection. This is actually an idea of Wundt's, but Titchener was the one that really perfected it. And what he would do is he would have people stare at an object or perceive something and try to break down that perception into very basic elements. So if you want an example of this, want to practice, what I'd like you to do is look at that very bright orange in the lower right-hand corner and ask yourself, when you looked at it, what was it that allowed you to recognize that as an actual orange? Some of you might recognize the color. Some of you might recognize the pock marks, those little bumps on it. Some of you might have recognized the stem, or the weird shape that's almost perfectly circular but not quite there. Some of you might have recognized the waxiness. There's lots of things that actually allow you to identify that particular object as an orange. And what Titchener was really interested in was which ones were most important. So he would flash a picture of this orange to people, a brief, less than a tenth of a second, and ask them what they saw, what things stuck out. And by doing this with objects like the orange and many other objects, he was trying to break down the human experience, trying to understand all the things that we did in order to make sense of our environment. And this work by Titchener led other researchers to start studying the mind in different ways. One of the people that started studying the mind in a very different way from Titchener was a man named William James. And when we talk about James, we usually associate him with a concept called functionalism. And this was based on the idea that even though Titchener's concepts might be intriguing, he had no way of actually proving that the findings he sought out to discover were a product of what people described versus what people were actually experiencing. In essence, he said when people looked at that orange, they had no way of deciphering or determining for sure what it was that they saw first, what it was that allowed them to recognize that object as legitimately being an orange. So we said, don't worry about the tiny little structures of the mind. Don't worry about what we see first or how we actually make sense of it, but instead ask yourself why we have these particular processes. What is so important about our ability to, say, see an orange? A classic example that he would give in his talks would be about the idea of memory. He'd say, why do we need to study all the subtle nuances to memory? What piece gets stored first, how it all processes? Because we can never be sure of these formulas that we come up with. But instead, we want to ask, why do we have memory in the first place? What's the benefit of it? What's the real impetus behind trying to remember pieces of information from our past? And that question led him to start creating his own fields of psychology, his own areas that nobody before him had actually thought to explore. And when he started doing these explorations, he eventually produced a very, very influential book in the field. This book was entitled The Principles of Psychology. This was produced just a few years after Titchener came to the States, 1890. But in this particular book, what made it so unbelievably important is he started using some of the basic terminology that we still use today in the field of psychology. And he started studying these ideas in an approach that many, many psychologists since him have now adopted and picked up. And as I mentioned earlier, he did this by introducing completely new fields of psychology that nobody had thought of before. We'll discuss some of those fields as we progress into what current psychologists actually study. But if you want to look for a big, big name in psychology, one that actually had a huge effect, not necessarily got the ball rolling with psychology research, but had a huge effect on the field, William James would be the guy. He was the one that really set the framework for how we study psychology nowadays. Oh, and just a side note, if you're interested in reading his Principles of Psychology book, make sure you have multiple months to read this book, because even though it was groundbreaking, he wasn't necessarily one of the greatest authors ever to live. And this book, though it was very, very influential and interesting, was over 1,000 pages long, was in very old English, so it's sometimes very difficult to follow. And James had a tendency to drone on and on about a particular topic. So even though we use it as kind of our basic book to understand psychology, unless you're a graduate student who has a penchant for pain and loves to suffer with reading old books, most people never actually pick up his book, even though it has its imprint on pretty much every psychology book that anybody's ever written. Now, what's interesting to note is that even though these three psychologists that we talked about earlier, Wundt, Titchener, and James, really set the groundwork for the field of psychology, with these three, psychology probably would not have been that popular. I guess with only these three, psychology would not have been that popular. In fact, if we go back to that question about what you wanted to be when you grow up, even if we ask college students that, if those three were the only people that studied this particular field or really set the framework for psychology, there's a good chance that psychology would have been a very, very small science. But one person, at least most people believe, one person greatly changed that fact. So most people attribute the growth of psychology not to the great minds of James or Titchener, but instead The growth in psychology has often been attributed to this man in the upper right-hand corner named Sigmund Freud. And it's not because he necessarily introduced anything that most psychologists support. In fact, a large percentage of his research and his ideas have been outright rejected by most psychologists in the field. But at the time when he became popular in the early 1900s, his ideas were absolutely essential for the growth in the field of psychology because what he did was he made the field sexy. Sexy not because it was all about sex, even though technically for Freud most of the time it was, but sexy because when Freud studied psychology, when he looked at the human mind, he started exploring avenues and topics that people wanted to discuss, people wanted to talk about. Talking about this inner self, the ability to make sense of dreams, the idea that each of us had demons embedded deep within us that could cause us to behave in very different ways depending upon the situation, caught a lot of people by surprise, and it made them very interested in this new field of psychology in a way that no other psychologist before him was capable of doing. Now, what's really interesting with Freud is that when he introduced a lot of his ideas in Austria, most people tended to reject his early premise of how the mind worked, in particular his ideas of the conscious, subconscious, and repression, which we'll be talking about later on when we get into the field of personality, was almost all out rejected by most psychologists in his country. But when he left Vienna and came to the United States, he wrote a book called The Interpretation of Dreams, which was, again, pretty much rejected where he was coming from. But when he arrived at the States, instead of being treated as kind of an outcast, as somebody that was unusual, American culture ate it up. Americans thought that his particular ideas were extremely appealing and very interesting and obviously worth studying. And that pushed a lot of people to start trying to add to Freud's ideas and understand exactly how he understood the human mind. And by doing that, by looking at his ideas, what happened in the field of psychology is it started to boom, in particular in the United States. And psychology since then has been very rooted in research done in the United States and in groups and labs that are there. Now, Freud actually returned back to Vienna to study psychology after coming to the States, but his impact was kind of everlasting in the sense that this field not only kind of transitioned into looking at more the spiritual underbelly of human nature and also transferred to being kind of a main focus within the States, even though over the last couple decades we've seen an expansion to other countries and to other areas. Lots of people, again, though, as I want to mention for a second time, have rejected most of his methodologies and his ideas. In fact, most people say nowadays that Freud was more of a philosopher than a psychologist because he never really did much research on his idea. He would just come up with very elaborate stories to make sense of things the way he kind of wanted to make sense of things. But if we're talking about somebody in the history of psychology that was exceptionally important for the growth of the field, Freud would be the one that we looked at. He also had a major impact on where the field went after he started introducing his ideas. It doesn't quite work the way you probably think it does. When Freud became really popular, lots of psychologists did start to eat his ideas up, loved to study it, loved to make sense of it. Some of them became huge advocates for his particular approach we nowadays call the psychodynamic approach. But at the same time, there were a huge number of psychologists that were very troubled and upset with the quick turn into this approach that psychology took. And in fact, a large number of psychologists, because of this kind of change into the spiritual slash mystical based perceptions, decided that we had to kind of put a lockdown on what psychology was actually about. And this led a lot of psychologists to go into a field that kind of counteracted Freud's approach. We call this field behaviorism. It started booming in the 1920s, and their main argument was that when we're trying to study the mind, it's just impossible to look at all the complexities to it and ask people to make sense of what they're actually feeling. So instead, what we should do is just look at the mind in its most basic level. Look at what we call human behavior. This is actually something that's still embedded in the definition of psychology today. If you remember back in the last class or the last part of class, we talked about psychology being the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. The behavior portion was something that was very, very prominent in the behaviorist movement. Because, namely, what they said is that even though we might not be able to explain everything by looking at behavior, at least we don't leave things up to interpretation. At least we don't allow people to add their own information that might not necessarily be true when we go into the human mind and ask people to explain how things happen or why things happen. So behaviorists decided to kind of counter Freud's impact with this rapid growth in this field of psychology that was taking on a completely new complexion because of Freud. And they started looking at the field of psychology as truly just a behaviorist field. So we now, for around 20 to 30 years, if you were a true psychologist and not a Freudian, started looking at psychology as a way to measure people's response rates, people's kind of reaction, this or that type of reaction, and we also started replicating studies in animals, in particular rats, chimpanzees, and monkeys, to see how the mind might work on an observable level. And that idea, that approach lasted for many years, all the way up into the 50s and 60s. But at that time, things started to change. In the 50s and 60s, people started inventing new research tools, new ideas that we didn't have back in the 20s. And as these tools became popularized, people started looking for other options. By the early 1970s, actually late 1960s if we want to be honest, a new branch of psychology started to form. We called this the cognitive revolution, because what psychologists started realizing was that even though behaviorism was exceptionally powerful, and it gave us a lot of understanding of human nature, it had some shortcomings that could never be overcome. One of the big shortcomings that we ran into was the fact that this concept of motivation and persistence, which was introduced by James and later picked up on by Freud, could never truly be understood from a behaviorist level. An example of this would be, say, a student that's told time and time again that they can't do well, that they're not supposed to be successful in school, yet they try over and over again. Or the athlete who's failed 100 times but still is motivated to come back. Nothing in the behaviorist realm can explain that type of behavior, at least very well. Yet when we go to cognition, when we look at a person's internal thoughts, we do have a chance to actually explain how this might occur. Another thing that was really interesting to researchers is how we actually distort our memories. So if I was studying things from a behavioral level, I would assume that whatever goes in is the exact same thing that comes out. But oftentimes what we find in memory research is that that's far from the case. If you ask a classmate or if you ask yourself a little while after this class what was presented to you, what you'll find is that your perception of what actually occurred, your experience, can vary dramatically from what actually occurred. And to study that, we again have to leave the field of behaviorism. One last big I guess solvable question that researchers ran into was this idea of a new branch of psychology that had sprung up called clinical psychology, where we looked at specific types of disorders. And unfortunately for behaviorists, even though there was this notion that all disorders should be something that was behaviorally rooted, there was really little evidence to show that some of the major disorders that people were suffering from actually had any links to the field of behaviorism. When we pair these problems with the fact that we came up with some really interesting tools at that same time, namely devices that we'll talk about in the next class called EEGs, fMRIs, we also had PET scans, and a number of other really cool tools, again, that we'll discuss in the next class, a lot of people started saying, even though behaviorism might have saved the field, might have allowed us to stay out of things that psychologists didn't want to get into. It was time to move on to a new area, and time to look at psychology in a slightly different way than what we had done for an extended period of time. And that push allowed people to start looking at psychology as a very broad field, like we had originally thought when we started to work with James. So now, when we look at psychology, instead of having it as just a behaviorist field or a very spiritual based field like Freud would have liked, nowadays when we talk about psychology, we've got a ton of different areas. And when we talk about psychologists, they fit a number of different categories. I know when some of you signed up for this class, you might have thought that you'd be dealing with therapy or people with only having different types of disorders. Some of you thought that maybe I was going to be trying to manipulate you all the time to get you to think in specific ways. Well, that's true of some psychologists, I guess, but in psychology, as you're going to see, the number of professions that are out there, the number of areas that we have are vast. And that's something that has to be attributed to our past. So let's look at some of the different areas of psychology that are out there today. When we progress in this class, this semester, what you're going to see is that psychology can be broken down into a number of what we would call subtopics. One of the major areas that's growing in the field of psychology nowadays, which we mentioned earlier, was the area of biological psychology, or sometimes we call it neuroscience. And this is an attempt to kind of revisit that body-brain problem, or the mind-body-brain problem. What biological psychologists are trying to do is find physical links between our body and the different processes of the mind. And as we progress with our ability to study the mind, with all the new tools we're coming up with, this field is growing larger and larger as each day, week, or even month passes. In fact, one of the biggest growing fields in psychology is this biological area. Another area that's closely linked to biological psychology is the area of cognitive psychology, where we look at the internal processes in the mind almost the same way Wundt did in his early research, trying to understand the basic components of how we make sense of our environment, how our mind actually works. There are still behaviorists around, but there are also psychologists that have studied other stuff that some of these early psychologists weren't really interested in, well, except for maybe James. One of the areas that we're now studying today is the field of personality psychology, which we'll actually have a couple classes on, or a couple lectures on in this class, where we look at individual differences, what makes you unique, what makes you similar to other individuals. There's a number of research projects going on that allows us to look at this field of personality psychology from a number of different avenues. Another area that's boomed dramatically over the last couple of decades is the area of developmental psychology. It's based on the notion that when we look at each of us in different ages, it's not that we just learned more as we progress, but instead it's that our brain actually makes sense of things, or our mind makes sense of things in very different ways at different ages in our life. And what developmental psychologists are interested in is not only how this pattern unfolds, but what allows it to unfold differently for different individuals. Another area that's closely linked to personality psychology and developmental psychology often is social psychology, where we look at some of the societal factors and the momentary social factors that change how we react from moment to moment, and also how possibly groups react from moment to moment. Again, we'll cover some social psychology topics as well. Another branch which has grown very rapidly over the last decade or two is something called cultural psychology. And one of the major areas of cultural psychology research that started to form is one that looks at the differences between Western cultures, namely cultures in the United States, Europe, Mexico, and Canada, and what we call Eastern cultures. So any part of Eastern Asia, South Asia, and very often also some areas within South America and Africa, even though primarily when we're talking about Western versus Eastern cultures, we're focusing on the differences between people in the States and people in Asia. Well, Eastern Asia. And these differences that we find between these cultures have led researchers to again appreciate the fact that society, social factors play a major role in how the basic processes of the mind actually work. The last area of psychology that's still around and one that you probably have heard many times before you actually took this class is clinical psychology. Looking at those extreme cases when people's minds do not act the way, or I guess process things the way most of our minds actually process stuff. So as we progress in class, we're going to look at each of these different areas, study some of the major topics that are explored, but I want you to appreciate that there are many, many different types of psychology that we can actually study when we're in the field. And when we look at what we do after we've studied it, I want you to appreciate that psychologists can go in a number of directions. After you get your 4-year degree in psychology, you can get into a lot of different fields. Unfortunately, this is something that always bugs a lot of psychology majors when I tell them this. There aren't many fields that are specifically directed towards psychology if you just get a 4-year degree. Usually you can get into things like business, computers, you can get into research labs. You can do a lot of things with a psychology degree. So it's not that a psychology degree is worthless, but you don't become a psychologist. You usually don't do something psychology specific if you get a major in psychology. If you move on for another 2 years after college and get something called a master's degree, though, you can start to do things that are psychology specific. You can do something called ergonomics research, which I'm guessing most of you have never heard, but it's a very, very important field where you look at how you can make things more accessible or work more effectively. So if I was working as an ergonomic person on, say, planes, I would look at how I could design a plane to make sure that the controls were where they needed to be. Classic example of current ergonomics research that affects a number of you are those smartphones that you use, like you see in that bottom right-hand corner. As you're typing away on your smartphones or searching for things or using specific motions, know that there's a psychologist, usually with a master's or higher degree, that came up with that phone to understand how your mind expected things to work, what was more accessible or easy for you to understand. That's one of the major areas that people don't necessarily think of as psychology related, but definitely has a huge root in the field. Teaching can also happen if you get a master's degree, if you want to teach at a smaller community college, even though most community colleges nowadays are looking for people with PhDs. Berkeley City College is definitely one of those. And another area that you can get into in the field of psychology is IO, which is involved in organizational approaches. Usually it involves things like interviewing, hiring, firing, getting people to kind of interact effectively. So we call it industrial organizational psychology. Another area that you can get into is marketing or sales. And these involve using some of the tools of social psychology that we've grown to understand within the field to make a company more effective or make a sales group more effective. You can get into some counseling programs with a master's degree where you help people with minor problems. You definitely have the ability to get into some major research programs when you have a master's degree. But if you want to get into research and if you want to get into higher levels of teaching, usually you're required to get a higher psychology degree that we call a PhD or a PsyD. PhDs are people who actually do significant research when they're getting their training. And PsyDs are people that usually are getting an education primarily for teaching or clinical work purposes. Now, most schools in the United States have pushed people out of the PsyD realm. In fact, PsyDs, even though they're not completely gone, are starting to disappear very quickly because a lot of people within the psychological community feel that all psychologists, if they're going to get a 5-year degree, that's 5 years on top of the 4 years of college, should have extensive training in research. So even though some people will be clinicians after, in fact, a large number of them will be clinicians after they're done, there's an idea that understanding research, being able to do it, is absolutely critical for you to be competent in your field. So even though you can earn a PsyD or a PhD nowadays, most people are being pushed into the PhD field so they can get into broad levels of research, maybe research groups or research for universities, be pushed to do teaching at a number of different types of institutions, or get into clinical work in their specialty or their area that they're actually interested in. And when we look at that clinical a little bit closer, what we actually see is that clinical work can come in a number of different forms. So clinical psychologists do study basic types of research, and they usually pick a particular approach. And we're going to talk about clinical psychologists much more in depth when we get into the field of abnormal psychology. But there's also other types of clinical psychologists that are out there that we don't necessarily think of. Counseling psychologists are individuals that help individuals with specific problems, social problems, and not clinical disorders. There's also people called psychiatrists who get their MD so they can actually prescribe medicine and have a high background in the biological side of psychology. There's also psychoanalysts who come from Freud. They also earn their own type of PhD. And there's people called forensic psychologists who get a PhD so they can deal with the court system, understanding terms of insanity versus sanity, help with interviews. Now, some of you might have watched some of the more dramatic television shows with forensic psychologists where they break down the minds of a serial murderer or something of that sort. It's not what most forensic psychologists do, but the idea of embedding yourself into the legal system through a psychological lens is what forensic psychologists are really interested in. So when we look at careers that are available, that are out there for people, I want you to recognize how vast the field of clinical psychology is, how vast the field of psychology is, and how many different areas we can actually get into when you start a degree in psychology. This kind of wraps up the idea of where the history of psychology is coming from, and it allowed us to transition into today's psychology. When we think about today's psychology, though, I want you to kind of keep some things in mind. One of the things I want you to recognize is that when we talk about today's psychology, what we're really talking about is what's evolved from our past psychology. And when we look at today's psychology, I want you to also realize that we really do focus on the scientific, even though in the past, science wasn't always the most important thing. In fact, when we look at Freud, we can see it really wasn't extremely important. But nowadays, when we talk about psychology, at least true psychologists that are accredited and in a good field, we really focus on research. Replication, being able to prove things instead of just interject as to how things might actually work. But to do that, we study a number of different things. And we study things in our own ways to try to make sense of the human mind and all its complexities and many different niches that are out there. Now, I do want to take a couple seconds before we close class today, though, to point out a few things that might bother you along the way or might cause you to kind of go astray in your understanding of what we're discussing or how things actually work. When we introduce topics along the way, as I mentioned earlier, oftentimes we'll be talking about some big theorists that are out there. But the word theory is embedded in there for a very specific reason. Lots of our early researchers in the field didn't necessarily come up with the rigid research projects that we now use in today's psychology. We still talk about them because they are the ones that shaped our approach to understanding the mind. But I want you to keep note of the separation between their theories and our understanding. I've always had students in the past do this, and I really hope you can kind of avoid it, where we'll introduce an idea, like Freudian research and Freudian terms, and then students will go home and apply them to their friends and loved ones. Freud's ideas, again, have been rejected by almost all reputable psychologists in the field. So even though we'll talk about them because it's interesting and it shapes our understanding of how we study psychology today, you cannot necessarily apply these theories to the human mind, to understanding how we actually work. So know that we're going to focus on science, but we will occasionally introduce theories that I need you to treat as just that, theories. The other big note you have to take home with you when we talk about psychology is the fact that psychology is not necessarily an exact science like a lot of the others. If we talk about gravity, you will not find something in your environment that breaks the rules of gravity. You might find things that kind of look like they bend the rules of gravity, even though if you explain them, you'll find those rules are still true. Well, in psychology, that's not necessarily the case. When I talk about a specific effect or a personality type or what's going on, the idea is that we talk about these as rules, as laws, because it works for most people. But working for most people is not the same as working for all people. So again, in class, when I'm introducing an idea, not only should you make sure you separate between theory and research, but you should also recognize that if I present an example, you do not have to search into your memory banks for that one person that breaks that rule, or maybe you are that one person that breaks the rule, and then conclude that if that's the case, this theory can't be true. Again, we're talking about things that happen for most people, or at least more people than we would expect by chance. The classic example of this is actually something that was discussed in your textbook. Research showing that the city people live in, I guess the names of people that we marry, can actually be predicted by something unexpected, namely your own name. So if your last name is Cheng, then you're more likely to marry somebody with the last name of Cheng. If you are from, I guess if your first name is Bob, you're more likely to move to Boston. Or if you are from a specific area where your mother's name or your mother's maiden name is something, then you're more attracted to people with that mother's maiden name. We're not sure why these things are the case, but we see percentage-wise that these things occur. However, that doesn't mean that everybody with the last name of Chang marries somebody with the last name of Chang. You probably think of 100 examples where that's not the case. And that's what I want you to kind of recognize and be cognizant of when we present these ideas. We're talking about tendencies in psychology, not absolute laws. But just because things can be broken, because there are exceptions, doesn't mean that it's not worth studying and that it's not an effect that's actually occurring. So again, as we go, separate theory from law, separate theory from research in particular, and know the difference between certainty and odds are something should happen. And that should help you understand these ideas much better and not get too flustered when exceptions actually occur. Okay? Now we are done with our first class of this semester. So what I'd like you to do is, if you haven't already, get done with those chapter 1 readings, and then after that, get that write-up submitted. It's got to be turned in by the due date, which you should see on that course roster. Make sure you know which time zone you're in and when it's due. And if you've got any questions along the way, please email me. Otherwise, thank you for your time. I will see you all very, very soon when we begin our second class. Take care.